and but we will not be able to vote on anything. So we'll put the minutes off, at least for right now. And just a couple of updates, or just to let you know, Lloyd is not going to be here. He's traveling. Charmaine can't be here. Kendall from UVA cannot join us. And Trevor Henry from Albemarle can't join us, but we will check it. So thank you. You don't look like Trevor at all. So with that, though, let's have our usual introductions. Lucinda, will you start, please?
Sure. I'm Lucinda Shannon. I am a planner at the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, and I staff this committee.
Lucas Ames representing John Urban.
Federico John, and Lucinda's twin today.
There you go.
I'm Gretchen Thomas. I'm a good downstairs in the Planning District Commission.
I'm Jen Fletcher from the Blue Health District.
Ben Chambers, Transportation Planning Manager for City of Charlottesville.
Diane McKeel, Albemarle County and JAUNT.
Ann Allen, Albemarle County. Jada here, the City of Charlottesville. Sarah Pennington, the TJPDC in my care.
Swan, this is Director for Welfare. Daniel Wagner, Department of Rail and Public Transit.
Christine Jacobs, TJPDC.
Carl Williams, Director of Charlottesville Area Transit.
Jessica Rich-Bellering, Albemarle County Community Development. Sammy Shackelford, TJPDC.
Guy Dillon, Campbell's Office, and Mr. Tom.
All right, and
Ron Thompson representing the Charlottesville Area Alliance.
do you have anybody, Jessica?
Yeah.
Oh, he did cut down.
So go ahead, Erin, introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Erin Belt with VDOT out of Richmond.
Right, welcome.
And we have 7 public attendees.
And 7 for the public.
Yeah, well, some of them are.
All right. So we won't be approving the agenda, and we won't be approving the minutes right now since we don't have a quorum. But I will ask Jessica if anybody signed up for a public comment. I'm sorry, we signed up.
If anybody,
You said that talking about Jessica, so.
we have no one signed up. However, if anybody from the public would like to speak now, raise your hand or, yeah, there we go. So Dan and Ziki is, go ahead, Dan.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, Dan Tannick Miller here. Let me know if you can't hear me or if the audio is not great on my end. It isn't great. And sorry, I would have preferred to speak a little bit further into the meeting just so I know I'm not off base, but I did want to chime in briefly and say that I'm really optimistic and excited for the electrification of our infrastructure here. And one concern I want to bring up succinctly that I don't see coming up a lot that worries me. I'm a data scientist that works a lot around international supply chains, and from a taxpayer perspective here in Charlottesville, I'm very concerned that over the medium to long term investments that we make into ICE vehicles, I'm really worried essentially that the networks that provide all these parts, right? We know that ICE vehicles have an order of magnitude more moving parts than EVs. I'm quite concerned over the medium to long term that those vehicles, we could lock ourselves into vehicles that are going to be increasingly really expensive to maintain and repair. And that's sort of what I wanted to introduce, was sort of this other, I guess you could say, financial fiscal responsibility side to this that I think may be interesting to people who aren't just tree huggers like myself. So thanks. I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think that you were referencing electric vehicles versus
Electric vehicles versus internal combustion vehicles, and just the amount of moving parts in an internal combustion vehicle that will need to be replaced over time. I'll put a little bit of this into the chat as well, since maybe it's not coming across that well.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Anybody else?
Yeah, so, okay, I'm gonna go with the online first and then we can do in the room. Ethan, could you email me your comments and I can send them to the committee? Okay, and Dan, no, wait, Dan, I'm sorry. Dan, could you please email me your comments and I'll send them to the committee? And Ethan, it is your turn to talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Ethan Heil. I'm an energy engineer at the University of Virginia. And I wanted to, first of all, share my appreciation. I was able to join the JAUNT Alternative Fuel Advisory Committee. I appreciated that opportunity and I thought that was very valuable. I hope we have a similar opportunity to sort of share the results from the Charlottesville Area Transit Study as well. Again, it's kind of hard to weigh in ahead of seeing the results, but one thing I did notice is common in these discussions is that there's a piece related to environmental impact that's usually left out, and that is climate warming due to methane leakage upstream. So usually these environmental analyses just look at tailpipe emissions, and I would urge everyone to consider upstream emissions as well. In particular, methane is the primary component of natural gas. It has a warming potential up to 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so it was unable to be included in a JAUNT fuel study. And so whatever you're looking at in terms of the results, in terms of global warming emission, consider that it could be 30 to 50 times greater if you do include those upstream emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ethan. And anyone else online?
There's no one else online.
All right, so would you come up just in the front,
Yes.
kind of so we can hear you and introduce yourself?
Oh, sure thing. Well, Caetano Campos Lopez with the Community Climate Collaborative. I would like to make a brief comment that I think goes a little bit aligned with something that Ben mentioned about the timing of these comments. It's not the first time that I speak to this board, but I do think that in many occasions, if I say something that's about to be presented, it will feel out of place. You're not going to be able to be with the topic in your mind yet, so something that's happening 1 hour from now is going to find a bit too late. But if I wait until the next meeting to talk about the topic, then it's going to be too late as well, because the topic is not fresh in your mind. So I would like to kindly suggest that members of the community have more than these first minutes of the meeting to ask questions or make comments. It doesn't need to be all over the meeting, but whenever there's a presentation or a significant topic being commented, if there is a small 5 minutes, 10 minutes opportunity for community members to ask questions or make comments, that will be very valuable for this to be more interactive and not so disconnected from the topics of presentation.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Moving on to our next item, alternative fuel feasibility. And I believe Lucinda, our first speaker or presenter is Ted.
Yes.
So I think this is your time to shine, Ted.
Wishful thinking, I guess.
All right. And I will ask that the folks that are on Zoom, if you can for some reason see the presentation or hear the presenter, please raise your hand or let us know in some way or another that you can go to the chat or you can raise your hand either way.
That's it.
I think Lucinda's monitoring the chat, but you can also raise your hand. Okay.
I'm going to real briefly present our work at JAUNT on exploring alternatively fueled vehicles. This is really a 20-25 minute presentation. I got to get done in 15. So I'll go a little quickly, so bear with me. Our goal is just to dip our toes into the alternative fuel arena We wanted to see if it made any sense for John to look at these kind of vehicles. Our inspiration was Garland, who was doing a similar study, and we actually piggybacked on it with his consultant to do this work. So thank you, Garland, for being an inspiration. So we're looking at establishing goals for our program, what are the different technologies, and where do we go with the different ideas. Again, we're just kind of exploring, does it make sense for John to have these kind of vehicles? My experience, very limited experience with this, is cars do okay with electric vehicles, for example, and bigger buses, but the market at the point that I was aware of wasn't quite there yet for vehicles of the type that John ran. But we thought technology is always evolving, so therefore let's take a look at and see where we should be. It would help us inform our future capital program as well. The goals for the project, again, we worked with an advisory committee. We had 3C on the thing. I don't know if you were part of it, Catano, but we had a few people giving us feedback. Lucas Ames was also on the committee. And we established a goal to, I think this is Virginia's standard, to have 45% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. We want to see which fuel technology would make the most sense for us, and what our high-level strategy would be to move toward that if it was deemed to be worthwhile. We looked at just about all the different types of ways you can propel vehicles, from diesel, fossil fuels, all the way up to hybrid, electric, and propane. The economic case for these is pretty compelling. This is a graphic showing the equivalent gallon cost for different fuel types. At the top, that blue line is propane. In the middle there are the various fossil fuels. And then there's a green line, which is CNG. Very at the bottom is electric. So electric would have the least cost per gallon equivalent. In Tulsa, where I came from, I had mostly a CNG fleet, and we were looking at electrics. In fact, we had 4 electric buses before I left. We were testing them out. So even in part of fossil country, we were looking at electric vehicles there as well. This is a profile of vehicles that are operated in transit. I believe these are mostly city buses like Garland operates. But as you can see from the graphic, most of the fuel is either diesel or gasoline. There's quite a bit of natural gas in the green bar and hybrid in the rest. Very little electric by itself. So this would be a new market. Just to kind of go over some of the different fuel types again really quickly. And I'm really conveying information from the consultant who knows far more about this than I do. But CNG or propane, they work in similar fashion to fossil fuel in the sense of gasoline and diesel. I know it is a fossil fuel, but the performance is very similar, has similar ranges. And in Tulsa, when we operated these vehicles, it was not distinguishable from the few vehicles that we had with diesel that they operated in the same way. The only difference was that the fuel cost was a lot lower for CNG. They would work very well in either a fixed route or demand response service situation. The point of CNG not being net zero was made. I believe the reason is we looked at well-to-wheel considerations for these fuel types, and depending on how CNG is actually produced, could create methane levels that Ethan was talking about. I don't know about beyond that, but certainly that was a concern that even though CNG itself was relatively low emitting, the process of getting there was maybe not very favorable. On electricity, again, it's a very different propulsion system. Again, the range is a little bit more limited than you would see on a fossil fuel type vehicle. And the weather can be an impacting, and terrain can be an impacting on the performance of those vehicles. Again, range is a big issue, and that really hurts us, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. And for John, our our fixed route services, our commuter buses are probably more open to this field than our demand response. Speaking about our potential, if we were to go that direction, I think that's our lean. We would need to establish fast fueling stations, fast charging stations for an electric vehicle. And the green dots on the right side of the map are areas where we tend to focus on in our rural areas. All of our rural areas tend to feed into a more urbanized part of the counties, and we could establish fast charging stations there. Possibly when the driver is on his break, recharge the vehicle would be a possibility. Hydrogen fuel cell that takes hydrogen to gas and turns it into electricity. This technology works in a similar fashion to electricity. It's not a new technology. For those of you familiar with it, the Apollo space program used fuel cells and journeys to the moon, so it's been well over in use for 50 years. The main challenge with hydrogen is producing it. There are difficult ways in getting hydrogen to a station to create it, and this does indicate there are upstream emissions related to that as well. However, it could pretty much work if you can get past the production of the fuel. In looking at JAUNT's situation, we have two types of services, fixed route and demand response. This chart shows our various work that we do on the fixed route side, and it shows how far our buses tend to travel. Those are the horizontal lines. The vertical lines are the ranges of various technology. All three of the vertical dashed lines are various assumptions about how far you can get on electric charge. And the worst assumption, which is you only get 40% reduction, you're only able to get 40%, 60% of the charge out of the life of the charge. Most of our services would fall within that range. So it would appear though our fixed route component of our service could probably work well with an electric powered vehicles. Demand response is a different question. Same nomenclature here in terms of the graphic. Most of our demand response would exceed the range of an electric vehicle, well within the range of natural gas and hydrogen, however. If we were to go with electric, we would have to have some sort of way to fast charge the vehicles, which would allow us to keep the vehicle out pretty much all day in our services. We operate in the rural areas, but we do tend to go in and out of the urbanized portions of the rural areas, and that's probably where the stations would need to be located. We've had a qualitative look at the different technologies, pros and cons. Battery electric may be good on a small scale with our fixed route buses, but the vehicles are costly, and so is the charging equipment. Fast charging, we would have to have a network of charging stations throughout our service area. CNG, RNG, hydrogen have their issues as well. In terms of reducing emissions, RNG, renewable natural gas, has the best return. It looks like a battery is second, hydrogen is a close third, and then the other two are not as attractive. This is a chart that has high-level cost comparison and the potential in emission reduction. The best ones would be the RNG. However, battery electric with the fast charging is a little bit more expensive of all the options, though the operational costs tend to be a little bit more attractive than the other modes. So the recommendation from the group was that we would look at implementing battery electric vehicles, maybe start with a small scale for a fixed route fleet, look at developing partnerships, probably in the rural areas with fast charging stations. Some of the funding that I think Aaron Belt's going to talk about may help us leverage some of this stuff. In fact, we did submit a proposal to the RPT to look at implementing electric buses in our service area. We've been given the green light on that, no pun intended. And so hopefully starting in July, we'll be able to get a consultant going to see where and how and when we might do this type of service. Should I do it in 15 minutes?
Oh, I wasn't keeping track.
Okay. Yes,
Sorry.
pretty close.
Sorry, Ted.
What? I went over?
No, yeah, we were gonna take questions at the end.
I just,
Yeah.
after all of them,
Okay.
Yeah,
after everybody?
yeah.
Okay, that's good. All right, I'll just leave my questions. I have a clarification that you said you submitted a proposal to the RTP.
DRPT.
Oh, DRPT.
Yeah.
I was gonna
Left
say.
out the D.
Yes.
And it's for a technical study to implement this stuff, and it's been recommended for funding.
So that's for DRPT, good.
Right.
The RTP was covering me, okay.
Well, we'll take money from anybody.
I'm sure, but thank
I'm
you.
behind in my homework and I have not read the full packet, but it tells what RNG is in your big report.
Yes, RNG is renewable natural gas.
Yes.
It involves cows, which is
I
interesting.
can help you with that.
Yeah, so we can talk about that in politer company. Yes.
Got it.
So, we said this still setting up, a quick question.
Yeah.
You will be presenting this, I would assume, to city council?
I wasn't planning on it. If they would like to, I would certainly be open to doing so.
I just was curious.
Madam, by the way, could we promote Mike?
So
No.
by invitation,
He's
you
in
would be
the
invited,
audience.
you would be presenting it to city council?
Well, I haven't been asked.
Presentation.
That's what I'm saying, by invitation.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Well, but, yeah.
Do they like to have proposals submitted? I mean,
No, the proposal, just the information.
no, that's what we did. They like speaking.
By invitation, we'll say, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I was confusing that with cat, that's on there, but it's not.
You're still waiting for the petition from the board of supervisors.
Come on up, anytime. All right. Next up is, we have Kat.
Yep.
And Ben is presenting.
Yep.
All right, Ben, that's great.
Wrong presentation.
It was RPD's presentation, but there was a cat list on the front, so you pulled up the cat one.
Thank you.
In there.
It's a PDF.
That makes sense.
We should be able to full screen
Yeah,
it up.
there you go. It opens up on the website. Which is why I closed it. Yeah.
That's work better. Yeah. Technology is the world.
Yeah. Technology's great until it's not, right? There we go.
And if you can invite Mike Jingledecker from the audience to be part of it.
Yes.
In case we need to call him.
And just for the record, would you introduce yourself as you start?
Sure.
That's great.
Ben Chambers, I'm the City of Charlottesville's Transportation Planning Manager, and I'm helping Kat out with this study as long as I can get this to cooperate. All right, so I'm not even going to worry about full screen. Y'all can see the slide from here. So what's the first big difference between us and JAUNT's study that you guys just learned about? It's a bigger study from the outset. JAUNT's going after an implementation plan based on their feasibility study. Ours is at the beginning of an entire study that will lead to us looking at our site for the facility and coming up with a full zero emission transition plan that we can hand over to the federal government. So we're just at the beginning of this, trying to figure out what is the fuel that we want to move forward with. And then based on that, how do we program out the space at our yard, figure out where we need to put fueling sources, where we need to put extra buses for expansion. What does the whole site look like when we bring in architects? And then what does it mean in terms of what do we need to actually make that transition in terms of money, in terms of timeline? That will come out in the fall. So for this study, our purpose is looking at how we can go from what we have now, mostly a diesel fleet, to a low or zero emission fleet. This is in response to our climate action goals. Reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 45%, by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. There's a lot of funding out there, a lot of federal funding right now for zero emissions transitions, and that's what we're setting ourselves up for. You have to have the plan first before you can ask for the money. The other thing that's driving us is market and industry trends that are pushing everyone towards low and zero emissions vehicles. That's both on the demand side of, transit agencies are looking to be more green. Their constituents are trying to push transit agencies to be more green. There's also that from the industry side where they're like, this is a good move for us. These are better vehicles for us to put out. The issue that we're running into and why we need to do a feasibility study is there's concerns about these new technologies. We've been running on diesel for a long time. We know how it works. We know that it's reliable and we can move people with it. With these other technologies that we're moving to, some of them are newer, and we have concerns about vehicle range and about the timeline of our capital plans and how that might align with how these technologies are developing. So a lot of what you're going to see in our presentation is focused on those 2 points. And I'm going to start off with the vehicle range point because it is differing for each technology. So to look at how our range issues would be affected, we needed a network to apply this analysis to. We used our system optimization plan. That's the plan that CAT put out 2 years ago that looked at how we can expand from our existing routes and add more service into the system. This system would have 15 routes. It's a little bit different than what we have right now, and it would have 26 operating blocks, and that's basically a vehicle work cycle. So some routes have more than one vehicle on them. Some routes may have vehicles that serve them at different times of day, and we're accounting for every time a vehicle goes out, we want to make sure that it can get back to the yard without having to be, towed back. So we looked at several different scenarios for each of the fuel sources that we're looking at. We needed to have our sort of base scenario, which is the diesel buses we're running today. We also looked at 3 battery electric scenarios, and we'll get into a little bit more why. One scenario is looking at, based on current technology, you probably need extra buses just to make sure that you can cover all the bus work that happens during the day. So you would need more than a 1-to-1 replacement for your diesel buses. You need more like a 1.62-to-1 replacement. And I'll get into why that is in just a second. The second battery electric scenario would be if we had a fast charger. The scenario that we looked at was just one fast charger just at the downtown transfer center. And for the most part, that was able to help us get through all of the range needs that we would need. The last battery electric one we looked at was a 1-to-1 replacement ratio, which just assumes that, fairy dust is going to fall in the industry and it's all going to get fixed and we're going to be able to run a battery electric bus just as long as we can with a diesel bus. I will say that some localities are doing that. That is the decision they're making. There's inherent risk baked into that, of course. We also looked at hydrogen. That is going to assume the construction of a new storage and fueling facility, and as well as CNG and its cousin RNG. That would also assume construction of a new fueling facility. So first, we'll talk about the battery electric bus analysis, and this is very similar to the graph that you just saw on Ted's presentation. This is basically saying 2/3 of our routes we wouldn't be able to serve with one bus. We'd have to, at some point in the day, take out another bus to make it serve the rest of that service, or charge it on route, or have that magical improvement in battery range. So based on that, you only have a few routes right now that we know that we can run battery electric buses on today. Just a handful of routes. They're shorter routes. Some of them have shorter service windows, but some of your longer routes, your more heavily used routes, like the 157, like the trolley, are a little bit iffy, if not completely infeasible with the current battery technology if we're going with the one replacement. So then we can look at what does it look like for our actual transition and what do the timelines look like when we're talking about changing our fleet over. And ideally, this is what it would look like. This is what it would look like if we went with any fuel that was 1-to-1 replacement. With all of these, you're going to see there is a ramp up in the first few years, and that's to account for the expansion so that we can serve all of those routes that we have in the system optimization plan. In all of these, you're also going to see I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a light blue, little tiny box. Those are battery electric buses that are already put into our capital plans. We have 2, I believe, that are put into our capital plans that we would get in 2025, and that would be part of our expansion. That would not be replacing an existing diesel bus, that would be part of the expansion, and it would be a little pilot to see how that was all working out. This transition does assume that we would be 100% zero emissions by 2040, which would mean that we meet our goals. It also assumes a 12-year lifespan for buses. But not every scenario is going to be able to look like this. And not every scenario is going to look like this in actuality. Even if we program it to look like this, we also have to account for there's going to be some capital investments in fueling stations. There's going to be, with some of these, we might have to do some additional work with utilities. So there are some factors that can change this timeline. But the biggest one that looks different is what happens if we switch to battery electric buses based on current technology today and said, we want to mitigate that risk that we might have if we rely on just technological improvement. And this is what it looks like. We basically have to double the size of the fleet to make sure that we've kept up with the route needs and the work needs of our network. This is a little bit infeasible. So this is kind of pointing us towards, yeah, we might want to wait and see if the technology is working out, because there's no way we'd be able to afford this. So when we're looking at battery electric buses, we know that there is, on the one end, sort of the issue of it's going to get really expensive. On the other end of we're waiting to see how the technology goes. So there are a few ways that we can deal with this, and we're hoping council will give us a specific recommendation to go forward with. The first is just buy more electric buses, just bite the bullet and say, we know it's going to be expensive, but we need to make this change. The second would be doing a massive restructuring of all of our bus network and system. And if you want to put money into planning, I'm more than happy to do more planning. The third would be to do on route charging. There are some difficulties especially with the downtown transfer center, like bringing electricity in there, finding a site where we can put a big transformer, putting, whether we put the chargers in the ground or put them overhead. There are a lot of considerations that we have to take into account. There's also some issues of, do you really want a lot of big electrical equipment right there, right next to the downtown mall? So there's some issues there. The last option would be to buy really, really expensive battery electric buses that are big and heavy and could potentially have some issues with our street services. So these are a mix of potential options that we're looking at right now. The other fuel sources, not as interesting, honestly, as the battery electric buses, because they're kind of like, there's one reason why you can't depend on them quite yet. The fuel cell electric buses, this is hydrogen. This is really dependent on the maturation of this technology, and by that I mean the delivery of the fuel. Right now, we don't have anybody in Virginia that's selling hydrogen, and definitely not to any transit agencies. So that's a big issue. If we want to start generating hydrogen, that's a whole nother ballgame. That's another big investment in a capital facility at CAP. So that would be the issue with hydrogen. Natural gas, similar issue. We would have to figure out where the fueling station was going to be. To get the emissions benefits, we would want renewable, which is an even more difficult thing to develop. We'd have to figure that out alongside Charlottesville's current decarbonization plan and figure out how that was going to work. So there are a lot of moving parts with natural gas, but it is feasible to do it that way. Ted had a very similar chart. We have the same consultants, so it's not a surprise. We're showing CNG and RNG a little bit different than what Ted was showing, because we're accounting for it. There's dirty CNG and then there's renewable natural gas. But basically the same outcomes is what Ted was saying. The CNG may be cheaper, but you're going to get more emissions. The battery electric buses are going to be really expensive, but they're going to do really well on emissions. Hydrogen performing about the same as battery electric, but as I said, there's a lot of capital issues with that. Alongside all of those quantitative factors that I just showed, there are other considerations that we're going to have to talk through. There are issues with resources, there are issues with operations, which, reliability is going to be our biggest issue. That's our bread and butter, is making sure that we're reliable for customers and can get them to the places that they need to go. If we have a fuel source that doesn't allow us to do that, then we're not doing our job. And third, sustainability. So we need to be talking about the local impacts of emissions as well as the global impacts of energy generation. We also need to be looking at how resilient we are. So, if our electric grid goes down, how are we going to charge the buses to make sure they're still working? And lastly, alignment with local and regional policy, which leads me into what our next steps are. The next steps are internal stakeholders in the city are going to be meeting next week. And by that, I mean, Garland and I are going to be sitting in a room with all the department heads saying, how do we make this work with what your department is doing? Public Works, what are you guys doing with fueling? The environmental resources folks, what are you doing with climate action? How do we fold all these things in? How do we make sure that we're covering all the considerations for that? Then we'll be identifying external stakeholders that will both be public. Albemarle County, TJPDC will be invited to the table, as well as private and advocacy entities will be invited to come join this discussion, where we'll present everything we presented to the internal stakeholders, who will narrow things down a little bit and sort of told us what the city is capable of doing. From that external stakeholder meeting, we're hoping to take some recommendations back to the internal stakeholders so that they can verify that those things are possible, that we can move forward, and we can provide a recommendation to council based on that recommendation. We're looking to have that recommendation in front of council in July, so that they can say, yep, this is the fueling strategy we want to go with. And then that will lead us into, all right, well, what does that mean for space programming at the CAS facility? What does that mean for, fuel stuff that we need to start planning? So that's where we're at. I'll take questions after everybody else wants. Next.
Thank you very much. All right. DRPT, Daniel Wagner is next.
Oh, that's me.
That's you. Okay. Modernizing transit fleet. All right. Daniel, we appreciate you coming down.
Always happy to. I have a family in the area, so I'm always happy to make a quick trip.
Oh, well, then we'll call you more often.
All right, so my name is Daniel Wagner. I'm from the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, and I'll do a quick high-level rundown of our Modernizing Transit Fleets project, which, to give a pretty quick summary, is going to be a resource guide for our transit agencies to deliver on the goals of reducing carbon emissions at their agencies. Obviously, y'all's agencies are already starting the groundwork to get this done. We are really focusing on how can we as a state agency be supportive in them delivering their goals. So what is our role, and where can we provide almost like a one-stop shop playbook for them to use as they're pursuing these transitions? And I think importantly, what we're trying to do with this effort is to focus on specifically our rural and small urban agencies. A lot of our larger agencies in major urbanized areas are ahead of the game in this area. They're concentrated around DC already, so they have a lot of resources and more financing that's available to them. So we're really trying to tailor make this so that everyone has access to these resources, but we want to focus on our small urbans and our rural agencies that need a lot more help and guidance getting to where they want to be. Obviously you all actually, as rural and small urban providers, are pretty much ahead of the game for most folks. So we're definitely lucky to be in that space. So quick high-level overview of the entire project, and then I'll actually dive into utility planning and the financial and emissions reduction planning piece, because I think that's really pertinent to really talk about how complex these approaches can be. But our first piece is going to be doing extensive stakeholder outreach and agency engagement. We're going to be working with our agencies across the state. We're going to be talking to OEMs, which are the original equipment manufacturers, so folks who are producing buses, who are producing batteries, charging infrastructure. What's the state of play for them? What are the struggles that they're already experiencing? And where do they need the most helping hand to move forward? Then we're going to dive into that utility planning. For most of our agencies, they'll be working with Dominion Energy, but we do have a number of electrical cooperatives around the state, so we'll be creating a database for folks to access so they know who is the best person for them to reach out to. And then from there, we'll discuss some strategies to really tackle that utility planning piece, because that can be one of the most important pieces as you prepare to think about moving in this direction for charging infrastructure, for being able to deliver on your facilities projects and do that major capital plan. I'll get more into that a little bit later. The next, we'll do background research on the industry, some trends that are emerging to make sure that we really understand the state of play. A lot of this has already been completed by a lot of our agencies, and also was part of the effort that we underwent last year when we developed the equity modernization study, which took a hard look at how public transit has been and can be part of reducing carbon emissions across the Commonwealth. A big piece of this is emphasizing transit has been at the forefront historically, because when we think about reducing carbon emissions, we think about reducing vehicle miles traveled as well. Our public transit providers are already champions in this, and so how can we make sure we're supporting them along that journey to really move toward their goals of achieving zero emissions. Next piece is where it gets fun and tricky, especially for our data and finance nerds. We have a lot of work to do to develop a financial planning toolkit. And so what that will look like is twofold. We'll have one that's going to be statewide. How much is it going to cost the Commonwealth of Virginia to transition to zero emission public transit fleets in the whole Commonwealth? And then we'll also drill down into the nitty gritty of building a financial planning tool, sort of a plug and play, although a lot more complicated than that, for individual transit agencies so that they can understand for their capital and operational planning what it's going to take to get there. And in addition to that, also take a look at different emissions reduction scenarios. So if we have this implementation timeline, this is how quickly we can meet our goal. And so everything along the way, and that, as both Ted and Ben already touched on, there's a lot of moving pieces there. And I'll get a little bit more into that soon, but there's a lot of moving pieces to consider to develop it. It's not just a little Excel spreadsheet where you can plug in a few numbers. There's a lot to consider to be able to reach those goals. Another piece which I think is actually very exciting as far as an opportunity to make this project a little bit more unique is focusing on workforce development. So what are we doing as a state and also within our agencies to bring our teams along with us? So our existing mechanics, our existing operators, all of the staff that makes transit possible in each of our localities, what can we do to provide them the resources to be brought along with this transition? We know that there is a massive opportunity and also a massive skills gap. We have tons of hugely competent diesel mechanics that have a huge opportunity to now become mechanics for battery electric buses, for hydrogen fuel cell, everything in between. What are we doing to make sure we're convening these resources appropriately to save our agencies money? Because if you can keep your talent, then you've made a huge step there, but also bring them up with us so that we can see wage growth in the public transit industry. That's a huge goal of ours, and we want to see where can we be play a supporting role to help convene the appropriate people to make sure that that's doable. And then next, which will be one of the more practical pieces, a transition plan template. So getting you basically FTA ready-made template for going after federal grants so you can buy zero emission buses. Pretty straightforward. It's going to be getting us we're probably going to have one for rural, one for small urban, maybe one for large urban. We'll see how that takes shape as we go through the process, but basically being able to give you a tailor-made template where you can say, all right, now I have an application ready so that I can go after federal money. And then lastly, the DRPT action plan. What does DRPT need to do as far as our grant funding programs, state Commonwealth-wide policy changes that we might need to pursue in order to make sure that we're supporting all of these efforts across the Commonwealth? I think that will be a really interesting internal look into how DRPT functions, where our grant programs need to either grow or maybe be tweaked a little bit so we can support these efforts. So I'll dive a little bit deeper into utility provider engagement and that financial planning piece, and then I'll wrap up because I know my colleague over at VDOT, Aaron, has a great presentation waiting for us as well. So this is where it gets a little complicated. I hope y'all can, okay, that's a large enough graphic, but this just gives you a quick snapshot. I've pulled this, it's a resource from Dominion Energy, which gives you a little bit of a layout and understanding of where each of the steps are in getting your facilities ready to go for these transitions to electrification. And you have to really see the number of steps. These are just like a very high level snapshot. Each of these takes an immense amount of coordination with the utilities and also a lot of constant contact and a lot of money. The big thing is you have to understand first, where is your grid capacity when you want to do your charging? Second, do you need to make some upgrades? Because if you need to make upgrades to your infrastructure, that's a huge capital upfront cost. Utility providers will typically find a way to work with you to help mitigate the size of that upfront cost for that capital expense, but at the end of the day, you're going to still be in a place where you have to think about very carefully in your capital planning, where do we need to make these infrastructure investments just so that we can then plan to have a facility come online in the future. And then from there, we want to find ways where we can help our agencies collaborate for either shared charging infrastructure and also rate design. So finding a way to maybe find some cost savings along the way for our agencies, and also explore a little bit further where there's opportunities for feeding back into the grid. How can our transit agencies actually be part of the putting energy back into the grid? There's been a little bit of talk about vehicle to grid technology, which is typically surrounded school bus fleets. But we want to explore a little bit deeper in how public transit agencies can be a part of this equation as well. My colleague Aaron over at VDOT will talk about the NEVI plan. There's a lot of opportunities, which is that she'll dive into it. Charging infrastructure around the Commonwealth for all types of, all modes, so including public transit, single occupancy vehicles, freight, and long haul trucking, etc. So she'll get into that a little bit deeper, but we want to really emphasize where does public transit play a role in the Commonwealth's plan for this. But the biggest thing that we can emphasize here is you need to work with your utilities early and often, and often and often and often and often. But we'll get to talk about it a little bit more as each of your agencies really move forward, but it's a huge, huge piece of this equation. So the next piece is this agency financial planning tool, and I'm not going to just read all of these because it's quite exhaustive and it's still not even close to everything that you have to consider. But there's huge pieces that you have to consider, including those infrastructure upgrades. But when you're moving, when you're trying to move towards these transitions, these facilities, you can't just unfortunately often retrofit your existing facilities. Often you're going to have to build new facilities. In addition to that, important to us is operationally, are you still delivering high quality service? We don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we're actually reducing service. None of our agencies want to do that. But there are high costs to that, which are operational and take careful planning so that we can successfully make sure the bus still comes on time, still comes as often, if not more often. Obviously, we want to get to the goal where we're having even more frequent service at some point. So what do we need to consider from a financial planning standpoint to get us there while also moving in that direction of zero emission fleets? There's a lot of moving pieces, and this again is just sort of a small snapshot of a lot of different pieces that agencies need to consider moving forward. And then very excitingly, I think the emissions reduction tool will be fun for advocates, fun for agencies to really play with and really kind of get a sense of where are we, where can we be when we move forward with these fleet transitions. So this will be a tool, we'll develop a standardized methodology for how, with implementation timelines, how we can reduce emissions from our agencies, and how we're also being a part of reducing emissions across the Commonwealth. So there will be, just like the financial planning tool, there will be a statewide emissions reduction tool where we can see how we're doing as a Commonwealth, and also individual agencies, how they're doing and performing to reduce their reductions, or yeah, their emissions as well. And I won't again take questions now, but if you're looking to follow up with me on this project, I'm more than happy to chat with anyone. You can reach me at daniel.wagner@drpt.virginia.gov.
Thank you, Dan, I appreciate it. And while we're transitioning, I just want to make a comment that I see there are comments from the public in the chat.
Oh, sure.
And Lucinda, and they've been popping up all along. Lucinda, will you make sure that when you're doing the minutes, you include those comments from the chat in the minutes for this meeting so that we can all read them? I think that would be a great idea. And there may be some questions that can be useful later, you know? Yes. Yeah. All right, so we have Aaron Belt. And Aaron, I'm kind of looking, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me all right?
There you go. Just want to make sure we were communicating. All right, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you see the whole presentation screen?
I see a white screen with VDOT.
Okay. Perfect. That's perfect. So wanted to give out my appreciation for being invited to the meeting this evening. Spend some time talking about the NEVI program yesterday with the policy board and altered this a little bit. So there may be some things that a few of you have heard yesterday. Going to cover the NEVI program pretty quickly, but want to talk more about the charging and fueling infrastructure discretionary grants today and some next steps for planning. So for those of you that don't know me, actually, I think it went, nope, it's on introduction slide. Sorry about that. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Erin Belt. I'm the decarbonization lead in the environmental division in Richmond, VDOT central office location, in the newly formed Office of Transportation Sustainability. So we're about a year old. I am just under a year at VDOT, but I spent most of my career in construction stormwater, and a good chunk of that time at the state's regulatory agency, DEQ. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, and then talk about our NEVI formula program and Virginia's deployment plan. Want to talk about alternative fuel corridors and how they play into all of the federal funding programs related to electric vehicles, discretionary grant, and then some next step considerations and resources. So for those of you that are familiar with the bipartisan infrastructure law, that is the same thing as the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. Those names are used interchangeably. So if you hear one or the other, it's not confusing at all, of course, but they mean the same thing. So you can use those interchangeably. This is the law the president signed in effect in November of 2021, and it provides over $550 billion through 2026 for a lot of these types of projects. What we're going to talk about today are the electrification of vehicles and what that means in your community. So I'm not here to tell you what's the best fuel type. I'm not here to tell you which fund to go after. My goal is just to make you aware of the available programs and the money that can be sought after from your agencies. So with the NEVI formula program, this is formula funding that federal highways dedicated to states, including DC and Puerto Rico. In order to receive that funding, all of those jurisdictions were required to submit a deployment plan by August 1st of 2022. So using only guidance at the time, because the federal rulemaking for NEVI had not yet been issued, VDOT, under the guidance of the Secretary of Transportation, submitted our application and deployment plan in August of 22. We received our formal approval from Federal Highways in September, and we have been allocated over $100 million in a 5-year period to build out the alternative fuel corridors in Virginia. However, we only have the fiscal year 22 and 23 dollars available at this time. I'm currently finishing up a competitive process to award NEVI funding. So what this will be available for is for companies and entities to apply for this. You have to be a legal entity, be able to do business in Virginia, not be debarred from business in Virginia. And it's an 80-20 split. So most of these federal funding programs through BIL are going to be an 80% federal subsidy and then require a 20% non-federal match. And that means that if you've got money from another entity like EPA or Department of Energy, you cannot use those other federal funds to make that 20% match, which is critical and very important. So for our alternative fuel corridors, right now through round 6 of nominations, which ended in 2022, round 7 just opened last week. We have 985 miles along these routes in Virginia. So rounds 1 through 5, which started in 2016, the definitions of corridor ready versus corridor pending for electrification, those definitions have changed a little bit. So if you were to look at round 6 and round 7 nominations, again, round 7 is open right now and VDOT is working on that. And we'll soon have a public survey for folks to be able to provide input on proposed new nominations. Corridor ready means that you've got stations no more than 50 miles apart, no more than a mile off of the alternative fuel corridor, and they are publicly accessible with a minimum of 4 ports that can charge all at the same time at 150 kilowatt hours. So very few stations meet that. Thankfully, rounds 1 through 5 have a different definition, but at this time, we've got roughly 17 stations statewide that meet that at the fast charging level, that level 3 DCFC charging speed. And so the goal of NEVI specifically is for light duty vehicles and to build out that DCFC charging infrastructure along AFCs in the state. So more importantly for today, I wanted to talk about the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Grant Program, which is a mouthful. We commonly refer to that as CFI, but it actually encompasses 2 programs. And Daniel kind of hinted at this a little bit. We've got the Corridor Program, which allows for communities and municipalities and other state entities, or other state and government entities to competitively apply for grant dollars to build redundancy onto the corridors. So going back to the AFCs, currently I-66 and I-495 are considered built out because they have the minimum number of stations in the right distance apart from one another. But nothing precludes those localities, like Fairfax County, for instance, from going and applying for a corridor grant to add redundancy to the system in their county. The other component is community charging, and community charging is very important because there are components related to multimodal transit, buses, to fleet operations, which is really important when it comes to regional transit partnerships, because those are funds that you can vie for that do not have to locate those charging stations on an alternative fuel corridor, because it is community related and brings those charging opportunities into the community and away from the corridors. The application this year is the first time it's opened up. This again is also a 5-year program. So there will be additional opportunities to apply for these grants. Because it's the first time and unfortunately did not sync up with localities' budgetary processes, I think there was enough pushback on FHWA that they have now extended this year's application opening for an additional 2-week period. If you think you might ever in your lifetime apply for one of these grants or any other federal grant, please go and register for an account at grants.gov. It takes a significant amount of time, depending on how many application requests that they've gotten in a span of time for them to respond. Their website even says it can take us weeks to reply to you. So the last thing you want to do is go through the process of developing a grant application, and then at the last minute, you're not able to submit it. So again, because of these being fiscally year oriented, only fiscal year 22 and 23 funds are available for CFI grants, and this is nationwide. So this funding is just as applicable to folks in Southern California as it is for folks in Maine. Anyone that is a government entity that meets those qualifications for these federal grants can apply to these. For this year, Virginia DOT is not applying for a grant. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday. So one of the reasons why is because we still have not released our phase 1 NEVI funding. It would be really not responsible of us to ask for additional dollars when we have not spent the money that we already have. So we are taking a back seat this year and letting Virginia Clean Cities lead the charge on providing application assistance. We're still doing Q&A and assistance on answering questions and application questions and site resource questions. But Virginia Clean Cities is doing even more. They're providing syncing, partnering opportunities. So if you happen to be an electric vehicle service equipment operator, but you don't have a host, they may be able to sync you up together. But also they're providing a gap application statewide. And that's an opportunity that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. So again, I wanted to cover with community charging. It focuses on rural areas, low to moderate income neighborhoods, and communities with limited parking. So think about multifamily housing units, renting, people that may not own the outside of their structure to actually install charging equipment at their home. But the other part that where NEVI formula funding falls short, the CFI grants are across all fueling types. So does everyone hear that noise?
I'll fix it.
It's just, yeah, it's our.
We'll turn it off, it's our HVAC.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure it's not me. So the CFI grants, both corridor and community charging, allow for funding opportunities, not just for electrification. That's the NEVI formula funding program that only allows for electrification. But CFI also allows for hydrogen, propane, and natural gas. So one of the things that Jaunt and Kat talked about is which vehicles we should move to, and is it right? Well, the opportunity is there. If you're not sure that you want to go to electrification, you've got the opportunity to propose grants for propane, hydrogen, and natural gas. There is a minimum grant request. So this is another opportunity that if that $500,000 mark for a community charging program grant is a little bit triggering for you, that you have the opportunity to submit a joint application. There are some restrictions to that because you cannot have multiple entities responsible for the fiscal reporting, the data reporting. You have to identify a lead on your application, but you can still submit a joint application with multiple entities together. There is a max award of $15 million on community charging, but if you are interested in corridor charging, which has to meet the requirements of being no more than a mile from an alternative fuel corridor, there is no maximum award for that. All right, so some of the next step considerations. One of the things that DRPT and VDOT have talked about offline together is vehicle replacement. Is it necessary now? So if you've got vehicles, traditional diesel, and it's not at the end of its lifespan, does it make sense to replace it now? Well, it depends. Are you replacing it with another, say you go full electric, are you replacing it because you've got the opportunity to receive a federal subsidy to install charging? Well, the cost of that vehicle is still astronomical. So one of the things to consider is the pairing to the bipartisan infrastructure law is the Inflation Reduction Act. So while I'm not covering that today and I'm not a tax expert, the Inflation Reduction Act provides significant tax incentives and tax reductions on purchasing vehicles that include medium and heavy duty vehicles as well as fleets. So consider that, look into that. For those of you that have consultants like Kimley Horn, Jaunt and Kat folks, Kimley Horn's probably done an analysis of IRA already and can provide you with some of that information as well. But then also take into account that it's not just US DOT that's providing money. There are multiple grants, not just through DOT and federal highways, but also Department of Energy and EPA. So if you're looking for vehicle replacement on top of tax incentives and on top of money related to the infrastructure piece, you could potentially replace your fleet even if the time is not right and the end of life of those vehicles has not been reached at this time. Consider the benefits that you're providing. Are you providing better air quality and equity in your communities? This is a huge push from this administration, which is fantastic. If you've not heard of the Justice 40 initiative, that is a federal concept and program that requires that 40% of the benefit of a federally funded program under the bipartisan infrastructure law, 40% of the benefits of that federal fund must be realized in disadvantaged communities. So that means if you've got communities of color, communities with poor health indicators, all leading to things like poor air quality or suffering from poor air quality, that equity in transitioning your fleet to lower emissions is a fantastic way for you to serve your community. And then Daniel talked about this a little bit with utilities, but site selection is critical. If you want to partner and share locations, obviously space is going to be a huge need. The larger the vehicle, the larger the space. Consider that you have the opportunity to partner with other transit entities in your area, but utilities are going to be critical. Daniel highlighted Dominion, which was one of our 3 investor-owned utilities in the state, but there are a slew of cooperatives in the state that don't have the tools and the resources that our investor-owned utilities have. Where Dominion has an electric vehicle mapping tool available for anyone in the public to look and see if 3-phase power is available at a specific location, down to the granular level. You can look directly on your road and see what kind of power is available. The co-ops don't have those tools. So where Dominion may tell you it'll take a couple weeks to get back to you, it may take a significantly longer amount of time for the cooperatives in the area to be able to provide the same service. So just be aware of that. Wanted to highlight that VDOT has a public input website. So on this website, it's general information about our NEVI program, our plan, and that process, but also resources. I try to, it's not exhaustive, but I try as hard as I can to kind of collate all of the valuable resources that you can find everywhere and put it in one place. We've got information about the discretionary grants. We've got locality resources or local government resources. In addition to things like Dominion's mapping tool, if you're interested in taking a look at that. And then a couple more resources. So I've provided this presentation to Lucinda so that she can send it out in PDF form, but you should still be able to click on the links. If you're interested in reading every single one of the grants available through the BIL, there's more than 300. You can look at that guidebook or look at them directly online. Again, our public input website, Virginia Clean Cities website. And then mostly these are specific to NEVI and the formula program, but you can read about the discretionary grants on that page. It's a real humdinger to read. So my suggestion would be if you have specific questions about community or corridor charging, just reach out to me. You're welcome to do that with my VDOT email. And if you're interested in signing up to be on our stakeholder list, this is just an Excel spreadsheet that I send out maybe 5 to 6 emails a year about program updates and information about when we're going to be releasing funding opportunities. You're welcome to request that as well. And then if you have any questions.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate it very much. Well, we have really received a lot of information this afternoon. I'm in sort of information overload. Having said that, we do want to open it up for questions. And I'm your official timekeeper, so we have time here. So questions, who do I see for questions?
I would be,
Brian, sure.
I'd be interested if Mr. Chambers could go back and share one of the slides, or because I think it's indicative of a number of, I guess while he's working to get that pulled back up, do people really think that hydrogen is workable? Or is it just feels like something in these spaces, people say, oh, hydrogen. I'm just interested, I'm wondering maybe if the gentleman from DRPT or someone else
Because we actually have, our county one consultant is actually online. So we may have a couple of, for them, I want to, do we promote him?
To answer the question.
He is promoted.
Yeah, I'm here, Garland.
Okay, great.
Yeah, one of the things for me when you're trying to evaluate options is if there's one on the table that's like, seems interesting or unique or whatever, but really is not ever gonna work, just sort of take it and set it to the side. And I just wonder, people continue to bring up hydrogen. Hydrogen is incredibly dangerous in terms of a fuel. I can understand in terms of the thermodynamics why the amount of energy per unit is why it would be a good fuel source. But my understanding is that the United States we don't even have adequate hydrogen supplies for industrial uses. So I'm just wondering, is there anyone out there really, really taking hydrogen seriously, or is this just something that we keep talking about?
I'm happy to take this one, unless.
I don't mean to be brutal, like harsh. I'm just
So
talking about hydrogen. If that's just
so the main entity taking this seriously is the United States federal government. The Department of Energy has an $8 billion program to establish hydrogen as a reliable and renewable and sustainable fuel source for a variety of uses. I don't want to get too far into it, but the short answer here is the U.S. Department of Energy is aiming to create 10 regional clean hydrogen hubs across the United States. There are several in the East Coast area, one of which is relatively nearby, and that's something we'd be considering in some of the transit applications that we've talked about today. In terms of the actual technology itself, it is something that is viable and used at other agencies across the United States, but more so in Europe. Hydrogen really got hold in Europe and has been growing in popularity. So if there are specific points that you want to probe on, happy to do so, but that's kind of the high level. Yes, to answer your question, it is very much a viable fuel source.
okay. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Great question.
Councilor Pinkston, was there a slide that you?
Yeah, the one that you had with the difference between if you bought a bunch of buses to resolve the issue with,
That one, this one.
yeah. So this is the one where you buy a bunch of buses to take care of the fact that you can't recharge quickly enough, right? And then there's another one where you basically say, we're gonna have, go back to that chart.
This one.
The chart, actually, sorry. There you go. So the option battery electric with 94 vehicles.
That's the one-to-one replacement that you're seeing where we have that huge ramp
Yeah,
up.
right. And then the battery electric with fast charging. So you've got vehicle costs versus facility costs. It just seems to me like it's a no-brainer that the battery electric with fast charging would be much more financially doable than the other. I mean, you're talking about 30 fewer buses.
Right, and financially, you are correct that it is probably much more feasible. It comes down to where are we going to put the charger and how feasible is that specific location in terms of construction.
But even given that, yeah, okay.
So it's less of a financial feasibility and more of a physical constraints of the network that we're working with.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
We have some members online who have their hands up, and Ms. Felt from VDOT is one of them.
Great, because we do need our presenters to be able to address as we go through this. If you want to let her.
Yeah.
Erin,
Sure. I did want to go back to the hydrogen question. So while we have not at VDOT received a significant amount of interest in hydrogen specifically, keeping in mind that the CFI grants, you have to go directly to the federal government to apply for those. And I'm managing the NEVI program, the formula funding that's specific for electrification for light duty vehicles. We are talking to the Port Authority for what their needs are in the state, both at their Hampton Roads port locations as well as the Richmond port. And they have indicated that they have large manufacturers of heavy duty vehicles asking the port, what are you going to do about hydrogen? Because we need to make a business decision on how to move forward with what type of vehicles we start purchasing or manufacturing. So I don't have their names. That's they wouldn't even give it to me, even though I asked, but the question is there. So there are large heavy duty vehicle companies asking the question because they're making long-term business decisions on whether they should go electric or hydrogen.
And because of the prevalence of it in Europe, you're already seeing the range in there. So they are being able to use the hydrogen to get the range, the hours that they need as a reliable source.
Very interesting. And I would ask that members of the public that have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll capture them with our minutes later, but we're trying to get the questions answered by the board members here.
Can I just add,
yes.
Likewise, those online that can put it in the chat, if anybody in the room wants to email us comments, we can also include those in the
But we're trying to have a board meeting here with the members of the board, right, to answer questions and get through on our meeting time. So everybody that's not a member of the board, put your questions in the chat and they will be recorded and we'll get to them and answer them. And I think, Ann, you had a question.
Well, a lot of it has been answered already, but so hydrogen is not explosive and we don't need to worry about where you put these tanks and that they're going to go boom. I mean, this is ancient history, I guess, and shows I'm not current. But what's the deal?
It could be that Mike can, I think Mike has delved into this more deeply,
Okay.
but I do think that one piece of this puzzle is, in our project, workforce safety and safety around all of the technology is going to be one of the key influences. So absolutely, we can't not take it seriously. And Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding in my initial research is that hydrogen storage and safety precautions are not terribly dissimilar to CNG. But if you could expand upon that, because I know that you delved deeper into it than I have.
Yeah, no, Daniel's right on. We are used to dealing with flammable or explosive fuels, and of course, when everyone hears hydrogen, they go Hindenburg, right? That's the knee-jerk reaction we all have. That's not quite the truth, because that was a very different time and a very different manner in which the fuel was being used. Another myth to dispel, and to be perfectly clear, I'm not trying to advocate hydrogen as the best fuel source, but rather keeping it on the table as an option. That's something we're keeping very clear through all of our studies, throughout not just Charlottesville, but everywhere. The way that the fuel is actually used in these vehicles, it's not combustion based. It's an electrochemical reaction. It uses a membrane within a contained cell. There is no explosions of any kind within a vehicle. And so the way the systems are set up, they're very safe and rather reliable as well. The second piece is the fixed equipment, the storage tanks at a site. We're talking about cryogenic liquid hydrogen. There are fire codes that are applicable to all of these types of things. The tanks have to be rated very specifically. The linings of all of the pipes and the tanks have a certain, there's a lot of regulation that goes with that, and it keeps it as a safe fuel. The last comparison that we tend to draw on is, in the event of an emergency, then what happens? We want to plan for the worst. With CNG, we have the same type of detection equipment within enclosed areas, enclosed facilities, roofs, canopies, whatever it might be. The same type of detection or similar type of detection equipment we use for natural gas as we do for hydrogen. It identifies the leak and shuts it off, and there's all the safety applications. The last thing is, if there were a leak and it were to ignite for whatever reason, hydrogen, being so energy dense, is actually more likely to flare out if it were to catch fire. And this is dissimilar to how you see if a natural gas line bursts and it flares and it catches flame, it will continue to burn as long as the fuel is being fed to it. Hydrogen actually burns so quickly, it flares out and then it just becomes a leak. The one piece, and this is my sorry, I said last point, this is the actual last point. The last thing to consider is hydrogen is basically inert within the area. So while natural gas, if you breathe it in, is toxic or harmful, as well as vapors from gasoline or diesel, hydrogen is inert. You can breathe it. It's all around us all the time, and it's not toxic. The toxicity isn't there. So there's actually some benefit as it relates to that being present within a working area or things of that nature. So happy to hit on those little points here or there, but generally, yeah, it's safe. I don't quote me on this, but I don't believe we've had significant hydrogen issues in terms of an event or anything like that, ignition, at least not within our industry that I have on record.
Aaron, did you want to add anything? I saw you shaking, nodding your head, and I just want to make sure that you didn't want to add anything to the discussion. You're okay. All right. Okay, good. Well, other questions?
Yeah, that was very helpful and very educational. Thank you.
This has been very helpful. I'm the timekeeper, so I'm watching our time. And so are there any other questions from board members? Garland, did you want to add anything? You've been a little bit interactive with your expressions and your facial.
I'll just say, we are excited about the opportunities that are before us, but we just want to make sure we measure our steps, right? So we're talking about significant capital outlay. We need to get this right. We need to make sure that the process we go through, we are taking our time to allow the technology to catch up to whatever we buy. Because there will be significant improvements. It's not the same product it was 5 years ago. It's not going to be the same product 5 years from now. So let's take our time to get into the process, and then when it catches on whatever the fuel source we buy, and the development has the technology has caught up, so it's a really reliable source, then I guess we go forward and make it happen. But reliability was a major issue for me. What you asked Cat to do to be reliable in this region, that's going to be a major point of reducing carbon all by itself. And if we put something that is a nice toy, that it's a shiny object, and it doesn't work, it doesn't help any of us. So we need to be better than what we buy. That's all.
Just add one little thing, and that is the EPA LGAC committee that I'm on, both the climate subcommittee, various communities all around the country have succumbed to the shiny new toy and now have $1 million. These are small communities that don't have $1 million to spare.
Right.
And they're horrified at the impact of what they bought, whatever it was the hybrid thing, it didn't work, it requires all its time in the garage. Madison, Wisconsin has EV fire engines, it seems to be working great, they're lucky. But I will try to get all those notes so that I can share them with you and you can contact all these people and find out what their experiences are. Because it's, we all want to learn from other people's mistakes. It's like buying a computer or a car the very first year it comes out. You don't want to be a beta tester. Right. So, thank you for your caution.
And we shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel every time. I just have a couple of comments because I had an opportunity yesterday to join Albemarle County Public Schools to ride on their electric school bus. Of course, we all know Albemarle County ourselves, we don't have a transit fleet other than public schools. So it was interesting though, that, and I'll mention this just because what I learned yesterday, and I'm talking about electric now, is that their mileage, they have a longer range, which I guess that's the word to use, when they are air conditioning as opposed to heating. Who knew? I thought that was interesting. So maybe that's a good thing for climate change, but maybe it's not. I don't know. I'm just saying with that. And when we're running our school buses. But I thought it was fascinating that they did find that out. They have, Albemarle County Public Schools has 2 electric vehicles. They have 2 more coming in September. They have had issues with not the electric vehicles themselves, because what they're using is they have these 2, and they're going to have 2 more, and they're using them as pilots to figure out what the ranges are doing right now and how they can best utilize them. So the 2 that they're using are running through the urban ring of Albemarle, of course, which makes perfect sense. But they have had issues with the electric grid, with the charging stations, and then the grid, I guess, for the lack of a better word, going down and then not, you pull up and all of a sudden the electric bus is fine, but you can't charge it because the charging station is not working properly. Now, they said they thought they'd resolved that, but I did think it was interesting. And just one more comment, and I would say that in a perfect world, if we were using electric buses, and we're talking about rural areas and trying to figure out how to charge buses in rural areas, the discussion in Albemarle about moving our school buses, assuming there would be electric at this point, and our charging stations to our rural schools, it would seem like to me that we would certainly want to think about how Albemarle and Charlottesville and CAT and our school bus system could partner together, because there's no reason that we would have those charging stations at schools and JAUNT and CAT not be able to use them. I'm just saying, just something to think about in the future. And I'm probably taking this down into the weeds here, but it did occur to me yesterday when I was riding that electric bus. Are there any other questions?
I didn't want to make one comment.
Yes.
I want to make sure everybody knows that we at CAT, as a part of our submission for funding, capital funding, for next year, we put in as a part of our expansion, not our replacement, but expansion to battery electric vehicles as a part of our pilot. Well, that's the for us to say that. And part of us testing out the technology out there, right? So I know CTV, I wasn't able to see whether that stayed in as a part of the submission, because remember, we're required to have our alternative fuel study, the transition plan completed before we technically should be able to get funding to do these studies. We were far enough along that we were able to submit. So that was a good thing for us. And hopefully we'll be able to get those too. That doesn't mean we're buying more. I would love for us to concentrate on when we buy, we're buying them as a part of expansion, not as a part of replacement. Then the replacement model will allow us to continue to provide a reliable service while we work out whatever kinks happen. And we don't buy too many, so we have a huge problem. If we still have to keep these things 12 years, we've got to get 500,000 miles out of them somehow. A minimum of 12 years before we talk about replacement.
And I think that's what Albemarle Public Schools is doing. They're using buy, they're purchase for, and they're using to try and really get a sense of how they play out. It was fascinating, and I don't need to keep going down this well, I'm sorry, but it was fascinating because on the school bus, the drivers were saying that the behavior of the children on the electric buses has improved. And they are, yes, what the driver said to us was that the bus is so much quieter that the children are not having to yell and scream above the noise of the diesel. And I said, well, they smell better too, but whatever. But it was interesting that the drivers were liking the fact that the behavior seems to be better on the buses. And they've been using them long enough now that so it's just kind of interesting.
All right, so one of the things to put in the worry list, and that is a lot of complaint over the weekend in the meetings about the lack of maintenance or the cost of maintenance or the nuisance of maintenance of the charging station. Because they're starting to rely on these things in other places, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, and California, that are way ahead of us, and they pull up and everything's kaput. And so these are often, I guess, not in the same control of the system, but it might be somebody else's. Or there's some profit-making company who's running charging stations from the place, and they don't do their job.
And that's what Albemarle is finding, because the school system is finding with the stations.
Supervisor McKeel, Erin Belt from VDOT Online has a...
Oh, sure, Erin, go right ahead.
I wanted to provide some context to the model of looking at acquiring electric vehicles in addition as a pilot. Shout out to my alma mater here, the University of Georgia. I used to drive their diesel buses when I was a student. And over time, they have started acquiring electric buses and now have the largest fleet for university of electric vehicles, both with their fleet vehicles, but also the buses. So if you're looking at a model that's already done that, that would be great. And I love being able to say that I used to work there. But they may be open to having discussion about what's worked and what's not worked. But they've got roughly, the main campus is over 600 acres, and they've got over 33 electric buses that are running routes from as early as 5 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the morning for the next day. So there's only a couple hours of the day that buses are not operational on campus.
Very interesting. And what we have done is reached out to localities and systems to ask them to zoom in and speak to us. So we'll make a note that that might be an interesting outreach for us to hear some zoom in experience, right? So
yeah.
Very, very much. I appreciate it. With no questions, then I'm going to move us. It is 5:30, so I'm going to move us on to our next agenda item, which are our updates, our round robin. And Tim, go first.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. We're looking at 18% service cut in Greene County. They decided not to fully fund those. And we're looking at maybe 10% cut in Buckingham, limiting weekend service to UVA. So we're working on that. Effective July 1.
Wow, so tell me how that affects those communities. So Greene and
Buckingham. Well, Buckingham is not a bad decision. A very low ridership on weekends.
Okay.
Green, they have the money, but they decided to use it in some other way.
Okay.
So that's all I'll say about that.
Okay, good enough. But the Buckingham one was like, because I know that you've been very successful with commuter service back and forth from Buckingham.
Right.
So that's why I was a little surprised.
Yeah, well, the weekend is
ridership.
not as well utilized.
Okay,
But
yeah, all right. Anything else?
that's it.
Okay. Charmaine could not join us today, but I think I talked a little bit about Albemarle Public School bus system and what they're doing. So, and I know they're still working with drivers as well. Garland, I think everybody's working on drivers. So with that, UTS, we don't have anybody
no.
from UTS. Okay, then we're going to move back to Garland.
We talked enough, so everybody know, no big things that can't wait till the next time we meet.
Okay.
So Dave got one.
Can I make one?
Oh, absolutely.
The CAD has currently kicked off their transit strategic plan, and there should be some stakeholder and public engagement in June around goal setting. So keep an eye out for that. There'll be a survey, there'll be outreach to stakeholders, there'll be some pop-up events at like farmers market downtown. So keep an eye out for that. Help us put together our transit strategic plan.
Thank you, I forgot all about it, but yes.
Okay, that's good. And then is Katie on with DRPT?
Yeah.
She had an update for us. She was there, but I can't tell who's there, to be honest with you. My eyes.
She was here.
Katie Miller, are you still there?
No, I don't see her anymore.
Okay, all right, she had to leave then. So with that, RTP activity update, Lucinda, I think this is you.
I just wanted to share some updates on the projects and my activities with the RTP. So the governance studies in the third phase of 5 phases, we're investigating potential revenue sources, and we're starting to schedule meetings with the jurisdictions as individual meetings with us and the consultants and the jurisdictions to talk about what we've found and better understand what they're looking for. In April, Kat shared the annual update, and we had the presentation tonight. I've been participating in the Charlottesville Area Alliance Transportation Working Group, and I'm helping to work on an AARP project. It's still in the scoping phase right now, but it's looking at possibly starting an advisory or an advocacy committee, like just kind of detailing out how that would work and how it could be effective. And then I'm also working with the Blue Ridge Health District on their CHIP plan. And Jen's here, I'm gonna get her on the agenda as soon as I can, to improve transportation for health, improve bus stops, and investigate the Transit Advisory Committee. The Mobility Management Grant will be hopefully approved by the CTP in the beginning of July. We put out an RFP and collected proposals, and we're meeting with prospective partners in the next few weeks. We also have been meeting with some agencies who are interested in receiving mobility management services, like supporting their volunteer driver programs. And today, Peter and I presented to the Albemarle Rotary Club. We presented on the Transit Vision Plan and the Regional Transit Governance Study to continue to share information and gather support for those initiatives.
That's a wonderful, I'm glad you all did that, and how was it received?
We've actually spoken to all 3 Rotary clubs now in the last couple of months, and what I think my biggest report would be how many questions we're getting. People are really engaged. A lot of those times, people's just like, gotta go back to work. And I mean, we pretty much, people had, the president of each club had to cut the conversation off. So it's all been in favor of what we've been talking about, needing to have community voice, needing to improve service, needing to, looking at bus rapid transit or light rail, how's all that, part of it. I've been very pleased, because it can be, to a lot of people, it can be a fairly dry topic.
Yeah.
But I thought people have been very engaged. Lucinda, anything to add to that?
Yeah, today, people were really interested in light rail going up and down 29, and I know we have that study, and they just could.
That always goes up.
It keeps coming up.
It keeps coming up, yeah. We just don't think we have a population right now, but.
Every community wants one. I don't care where I go, there's always somebody looking for light rail, always.
It works really well in Toronto. I just used it a lot up there.
There's
But they
just
have
a lot bigger.
few more people up there. Just a few more. About 5 million.
Yeah, the density just doesn't work here, but anyway.
But it's been good. A lot of it's been planting the seed so that people know, the community leaders of Rotarians, that this stuff is going to be coming. Look for it more. We're going to need public support for these types of things. And I think we planted some good seeds with a lot of community leaders this past couple of months.
So what presentation did you all use with the Rotary Club? Would it be fun for you all to share that? Because you probably sort of created it for that group. Would you share that presentation with all of us? It might just be fun for us to see that.
Yeah, sure. I can
When you see at the start of it, speaks a little bit about the Charlottesville Area Alliance and why, because I show why the center's involved, why it's age-friendly, why CEA is involved, and then give the bulk of it to the subject area experts. So when you see the slides, you'll see that information to start before it gets to the transit.
They actually recorded today's presentation.
Oh, that's right, they did.
So I don't, if they send me the video, I can send you a link to it.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Lucinda's going to need an agent once that recording goes out.
That's fine.
I'm aware of.
It'd be great to see that presentation. And I will say that this group, at some point, I think the Regional Transit Partnership, it would be great if we could somehow or another offer an opportunity for the business community of Charlottesville and Albemarle to come and speak to us about what they need. And rather than us telling them what they need, I'd like to hear what they think they need.
Yeah, I contacted the Chamber of Commerce and I'm working on that.
Great, so as we did that, we tried to do that a few years ago, it didn't work, but I think the time is better now for it to happen, so that's great. Any other comments or questions from?
Yeah, one 30-second thing. For years, I've been working with the Coalition Against Bigger Trucks, which is working in Congress. Just yesterday, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee passed 2 bills that will endanger motorists and damage our infrastructure again to push back to the 91,000 pound limit, up 10,000 pounds from what's currently allowed in a tractor trailer. And the second bill would allow auto hauler trucks, which I think means just one vehicle, but I'll have to ask, to operate at 88,000 pounds, 10% above the current weight. So anyway, we're getting back engaged in that to try to make sure that it doesn't go on the House floor. But the last thing any of us need with our pedestrians and our transits and our bus drivers is more great big trucks falling off the roadways and falling in the drains and getting in the way. So definitely working that. When I get some more information, bullet points, I'll share those with Brian in case council wants to send it.
Yeah, like we do, we periodically have sent letters about that in the past.
Our country roads, we just can't help.
Yes.
We can't stop them once we get approved, we can't.
That's right. And then they'll go to the next round and bigger. Yeah. Bigger, bigger, bigger. All right. With that, any other comments, questions? Because if not, then I will adjourn us until June 22nd for our next meeting. Same place, same time? This was great, lots of
Please
information.
rise.
Thank you. We did not have a quorum, so we will take care of the minutes in the June meeting. We didn't support the town meeting vote on us.
Thank you.
All right.
Chair, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Well, I just need to
Stop recording.
Yeah.